everybody, and welcome back to my speed model part 2. Here we are. So, just kind of continuing off where we left off at. Now, one thing you should know, no, I didn't skip this part, making his fingers. I actually forgot to turn the screencast on at the time, so, it's really simple process. I just extruded a bunch of faces from the joints. Well, the faces, like the small square faces. It's extremely easy. A caveman could do it, you know, assuming the caveman was educated and intelligent enough to use a computer. And, of course, use Blender on the computer, because Blender is a whole complex system on its own. So, not much to talk about at the moment. Cutting some lines on his butt. Trying to, anyway, to make a tail. You can see me selecting the different tools. I made a nice cut there. So now I'm going to extrude, and then we're just going to work at it from there. Yep, it is a very stubby tail right now. So, yeah, I'm just gonna be here for a moment. Yeah. Maybe not. Alright, now that we have made our way back to the head, I'm going to end up pulling out a modifier in a moment called Solidify. And I had not actually used this modifier in a long time. Like, the first time I used it was like in one of my first project. Like my very first. That was back in 2013 or late 2014 when I was practicing in Blender. Like my very first time practicing in Blender, and it was for this glass bowl in this claw simulation tutorial that I'll link to later in the description, of course. And basically what it does is it thickens the edges of your model, and that might be useful for, say, a glass bowl or a plate, maybe. That really depends on what you're going for. For a character model like this, it isn't it's not I don't recommend using it, because when I applied it, I thought it was going to create the extra faces, because it thickens the faces and kind of creates more faces inside, and that might seem like a problem if you didn't have vertex groups. I mean, it was still a mistake to use the modifier, but if it did create more faces like that, which it doesn't, then one quick solution to keep it from creating so many faces is you apply it only to where you need it, with the usage of the vertex groups. You see me in this group tab here. There's an option, vertex groups. Basically, you click a plus, create a new vertex group, and you go into edit mode and you select vertices, regardless if they're edges, verts, or faces, and you select assign to that specific vertex group. Make sure you name it if you're having problems trying to double click and name it, just hold control and press like right click, or no, left click, and you'll be able to rename it easier. That goes with like anything you want to rename. If it's like on a scroll menu, of course, where else would you rename it at? Anyway, that's the vertex groups have many efficient uses. You could use it in particle systems to organize your hair. I created a mohawk with it one time, And the two arrows that, well, yeah, the two arrows that point opposite of each other is basically inverse, which, if, say, for example, if you have a mohawk on your model and you click the inverse, then every other part outside of that, the area where you had the mohawk, will have hair, or depending on what you have the settings set to, and that one spot will be bald. But then again, that could also depend on the settings and how your particles interact with the mesh. Sometimes there will be particles there anyway, so of course then again that could be dependent on how subdivided your model is. You will, if you do subdivide your model when you already have a vertex group for a lower poly, for a version of your model, you will have to go back, at least I did, and you'll have to select some areas that it basically didn't keep. Like, it'll preserve either most or all of your selection, but when I checked, it didn't preserve all of my selection, so I had to go back and select a little bit. So you just might want to be careful about that. Now, about the back to the solidify modifier, it's not good for the, if you, my hope was to make quick lips with it, and you could still do that by extruding an edge from the lips. It just takes a little bit longer, but it's totally worth it because, like I said, solidify doesn't create more edges and vertices. And what I mean by that is, like, you might be like, well, it's creating more faces here, it's making it thicker. Yeah, I felt the same way. But when I applied it, all the vertices were one face. And that might not seem like much of a problem, but if you want to texture paint your model, and you texture paint on, like, I'm talking about directly painting onto your model, or like painting it in the UV editor, that there aren't going to be multiple faces for multiple parts. It's going to be one vertice for, like, say, that entire face. Say you thicken one face with solidify. It looks like it's created like five vertices, assuming that you're working with a square face, and it looks like it's created 5, but really it's still the same one. It's just thickened that one face. You can go into edit mode and you can select that one face, and it will select only that one face. You can adjust where the extra mesh part, the modifier part, protrudes from by adjusting the offset, but it doesn't it doesn't create more faces, and I don't recommend using it on a character for making like lips or something. It's much less of a headache by extruding the lips yourself, and it'll probably look nicer too, or maybe not. I don't know. That really depends. It'll take a little bit more work, but it'll be worth it because reasons and fluid work, you know. So just be careful what you use that modifier for. And I am just going to speed it up until I need to explain something, or I think of something. 'Cause the world will doubt, try to bring you down, but your love is real. I can see a reason to try to fight for meaning, but you give me reason to know I still have meaning. I'm not gonna fall for gravity, 'cause you lift me up when I can't feel. actually about to get into making the ear. Now, ears have always been a little bit complicated for me. Um, really, I don't recommend doing them in edit mode. I recommend raising the poly count and like subdividing those specific faces and then using multi-resolution, which I'll explain later, I guess. And I'll explain it now. Multi-resolution basically subdivides your model, but only in edit mode, sculpt mode, I think, yeah, texture paint and weight paint and vertex paint. Everywhere else but edit mode. It keeps your low poly model in edit mode. But you should know that when you sculpt in sculpt mode, what you do in sculpt mode, you'll see it across edit mode, texture paint mode, weight paint mode, everywhere but edit mode. And one thing you should also note is that you do not, if you've got any progress on your sculpt, your any sculpt data on your model, and say that you want to keep that data, you don't want to delete your multi-resolution, because your multi-resolution is what's preserving that detail. Now, you can apply your multi-resolution, but remember that that's going to subdivide your model for that detail. So the higher the subdivide count, the more detail you can sculpt into your model. Just like totally remember that. And what I had to do for this model when I got around to actually fixing the head was I subdivided the ears, well, the area around the ears. Like I created a triangle section, and oh yeah, and that crazy mess right there happens if you apply your if your solidify modifier is stacked higher than your subdivision modifier, because is the modifiers are applied in the order that they are stacked. The newest modifiers will always apply first, depending on what they are. If it's an armature modifier, it remains constant and unaffected by the other modifiers, at least from what I can tell. However, the solidify modifier and the solidify modifier and the subdivision surface modifier pretty much fight. They fight like crazy, as you can see. That's just metaphor, sarcasm. Basically, you're subdividing your low poly. You're subdividing your low, not subdividing. You're solidifying your low poly mesh, while your subdivision surface modifier is subdividing it, but separately. You kind of see how that works. It's doing the process separately, kind of. But if you subdivide your model or like basically if you use the arrow on the top right corner of the modifier, you press the down arrow to reorganize them, your problem will be fixed, because you'll be then subdividing and then you'll be solidifying. And you can, and even then, if you reorganize the solidify modifier, bring it down under any subdivision type modifier, and you can apply it then, and your mesh will be safe from that chaos that you just witnessed. Now, right here, I'm going right back to the neck area, and this is where I'm going to, someday I'm going to apply that method I told you about, where you have to separate the jaw from, well, like his jaw from like the back of his head, or maybe that's like the center point of his head, kind of. You're gonna see it in a moment, and it's going to make it so much better. It's going to clean it up a bit. I think I actually end up pressing revert because I messed it up so badly. But you'll see me do it in a moment. I'll just like skip ahead, and well, I'll speed it up.
Sleep till I come home. Dream of something sweet. I won't be there soon to wake you so discreet.
So now I have removed the subdivision surface modifier and replaced it with the multi-resolution, and they both, I've explained what the multi-resolution does. They both just do the same thing, except the multi-resolution just saves your sculpting data, and your subdivision surface just kind of like keeps everything you do from the base rather than a specific level of detail. Like, you can adjust the different levels, as you can see there, when you press the subdivide button, and you'll notice that even when you go into sculpt mode, you'll see that message right there. Sculpting might be unpredictable. It's just because of it's not like a perfect uniform shape. It's not like a perfect square or perfect cylindrical, so it's just might be a little bit unpredictable. Just be careful with certain settings, because you're sculpting, like if you select dynamic topology, I haven't really used that much. Oh, and I'm waving around telling you that the X mirror is normally always on by default. You can activate the different ones by just clicking the X, Y, and Z axis. The X. So first of all, the little circle thing that you saw me doing earlier that turned like half of the model like a grayish color was basically lasso masking, which is I think shift control or shift alt and then left mouse, and like you gotta hold it and then release, I believe. And also we are at this point because I ran into this huge problem. The screencasting here, I was using the wrong file. For the screencast file output. I was using the AVI RAW, which takes way more memory to save. You can see that I have a dedicated folder for it, and I had to use Format Factory to change the back into an AVI file, just to basically compress the size of the files down. That's very important. If you're using the screencast feature of Blender and you want to save your screencasts, I recommend, like, you want to save them as a video, I recommend using AVI JPEG. It takes up the least amount of memory for the videos, and it's just like an MP3. It just, since it doesn't record any sound, and the screencast only records what's inside Blender, the Blender window. And if you minimize the window, I think if you minimize the window, I know if you like move the window around, it will stop the screencast. If you if it freezes and then respawns again, it will stop the screencast. Now, the only thing about screencasting inside Blender rather than using a software is that every time that you stop the screencast, you'll have to go and rename each file each time. Like this whole time, when I stopped the first clip, I had to name it Tobias Screencast 1, and then the next clip I stopped, I had to rename that one Tobias Screencast 2. All I did was I changed the number. You can name it whatever you want. Just remember to name them like, so your computer will sort them in a alphabetical order or numerical order. Like, the 1, 2, and the 3. That makes it super easy. That's what I did. Now, you see here, I was more like testing a theory with the ear. I was testing my theory with the with subdividing the corners like that, and I went to sculpt mode and I smoothened out the craziness, and I just decided to experiment with the ears in it, and it worked out just the way I explained it. And I spent all that effort trying to make the ears look nice, and I just ended up starting over, basically. I think I can't remember if I deleted the head or if I just re-sculpted it. I remember I had a lot to do. The head did look kind of horrifying, according to one of my friends. He looked scary. Scary is just a nice way to put it for me. Yeah, mind you, he's supposed to be looking like an otter right now. To me, at the time, he looked kind of like an otter, but this was that part where I wasn't paying enough attention to the reference. Like, his eyes are supposed to be closer to his nose, and he looks kind of like a canine, and an otter does not look like a canine. It doesn't. It has like this really big nose, a really big head. Like, wow, their heads are big, and they have a really small face too. Just something like if you're going to do an otter or something. It's like I said in the beginning. Pay attention to your references, and you hopefully won't screw up like I did. I really kind of messed it up by this point. Now, for some reason, I thought it still looked like an otter, and that cut right there was just my attempt to try and make an eye socket. And what I ended up doing was I went into edit mode, and those were 2 whole faces, and that's still not something you want. You want to subdivide those faces, and And that's eventually what I did. I subdivided that area with the eye sockets, and then I sculpted in some eye sockets, and I brought them closer to the nose using the grab brush. So I'm gonna just speed this up until. Oh, before I do that, there's something very important. I just clicked invert to basically invert the mask there, so it would hide. It would invert the mask to whatever I didn't select, which would be the head in this case. Uh, One thing you should know, if you're modeling with if you happen to never have cleared your mask and you can see all of your model, like this was, I think it was a glitch or something later on. I couldn't model the body. No, I couldn't sculpt my model's body because I still had the mask on it, and I kept trying to figure out why I couldn't sculpt it. And it turns out that if you have your mask, if that particular area that you're trying to sculpt that isn't manipulating at all has a mask on it, it's for some reason it will not manipulate at all, and I don't really understand that. I was able to see the model, but nothing was happening. So just make sure when you go to model something, uh, clear the mask, unless you don't want to model that specific part. Then you know the drill. You know, don't clear the mask if you're not gonna work on that area. And there's even a brush that you could use. There's uh, lasso masking, and then I think there's box masking, which you can find in the hide and mask right next to the sculpt button. And there's a mask brush. So they give you plenty of options, and there's also like, and that's another thing I forgot to mention. You can also go online and find and download extra brushes. There's this extra feature in Blender that actually has loads of features. They're called add-ons, and they can revolutionize the way you use Blender because they just come with so many features created by the community, and I've seen people use them. I haven't downloaded any add-ons yet, but I've seen people use some of the add-ons, like this one that's called a sapling add-on, and it's basically like a quick way to make some branches and make some leaves. Like it's an entire working tab devoted to making a little like a branch, or you could even adjust the size of it and how many leaves you wanted to put on it. It's really cool, and that's just one of the add-ons. There's like add-ons for everything, and then there's add-ons for things that you didn't even know that you would need or use. So it's important that if you want to get really serious about Blender and you want to add some things, definitely go check out the add-ons that the community has to offer. And remember that there's the community add-ons and there's the official add-ons. And then another thing to notice, the add-ons, they might not work with your current version. They might be for outdated or version of Blender, or maybe you have an outdated version of Blender and they work for a newer version. So that's pretty much all I have to say. Oh, and also to find the add-on panel, you go to preferences, and like I think it's like all the way to the right. It you can't miss it. It's an add-on tab. You just click it, and like I can't remember the exact details at this moment. Like if you just hover your cursor over the buttons, they should tell you in like a little box, tell you what they do. So, that's something important about the fingers. If there's any part of the model that you need to be careful with, it's the fingers, because they need to be pretty much perfectly straight, because like, say for example you've got angled fingers, or say like your fingers don't have 3 joints but they instead have 2. uh, the Everything you do, like if you're going to pose your model, you really want to think far ahead. uh, you want to you want to make it easier to rig. You want to make sure that when you do rig it, that that is going to deform properly when you pose it. And the fingers, they're extremely important to get correct. If they're like not perfectly aligned and you've got some of the vertices kind of twisted, or you've got an edge kind of bent in, that finger is going to deform properly, and it's going to bend. It's going to deform. Like, say if you're going to bend the finger, it's going to deform improperly, like it's going to bend that way. You could just like, it won't have such a drastic effect when you're making these bends in sculpt mode, but in edit mode, if you have messy fingers, you're going to have a messy bend. So you definitely want to fix that before you spend like, oh, I don't know, like 2 or 3 hours of free time that you wouldn't normally have just trying to fix the fingers. I didn't spend that much time on this one, but my last model I spent way too long on the fingers uh, for multiple reasons, and it was just a horrific mess and a headache that you just don't want to get yourself involved into. So remember that. Pay attention to your work. And another thing that is actually kind of interesting to know. I was watching a video, Andrew Price was talking about photorealism. I'll link everything that I talk about into the description. He was talking about photorealism, and one thing that I kind of knew before I watched his video, but he confirmed it, was that when you're modeling something, it's extremely, like, it's more important when you're modeling something to have a reference of the actual thing, if you can get it. But it's even better if you have like the actual object. I might have just repeated that, but anyway, if you have, like, say you're modeling a gas can, it's good to have an actual gas can to look at, so you can actually look at the dimensions of the gas can, and then model it into the say that you're modeling a gas can. Oh dear, I just realized how long this video is. Well, I will just continue this in another part. Yeah, sorry, just to suddenly cut it off. I was going to try and cut this off at 32 minutes, and here we are at 38. So, yeah, I will just see you in the next part. Yay.